The sea was angry that night. Dark clouds rolled like beasts across the sky, and lightning split the heavens apart. The wind screamed, bending the towering waves as if the ocean itself was writhing in pain. Beneath the chaos, in the deepest trench of the Blackwater Sea, a mermaid lay still. Her name was Naylora, once a song of the ocean, now a whisper lost in the dark. Her tail, once shimmering with the light of 1,000 pearls, was lifeless. The magic that once let her glide through the waves had vanished, leaving her paralyzed and sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss. The water around her was cold, uncaring. The voices of her own kind had long faded. She had been abandoned. "She is cursed," the merfolk had said, their glowing eyes filled with fear. "No one can save her. Let the sea take what it must." And so, the ocean had claimed her. Naylora tried to fight the sinking weight in her body, but her tail would not obey. She tried to sing, to call out to the sea gods, to anyone who would listen. But her voice was weak, a fading echo against the deep. Her silver hair swayed like ghostly strands in the dark water, and her sapphire eyes, once bright with life, were now filled with sorrow. She would drown in the place where no light ever touched. But fate had other plans. Above the roaring waves, a ship sliced through the storm like a phantom. Its black sails, tattered but proud, bore the mark of the Kraken's vow. A ship whispered about in both fear and awe. At its helm stood Captain Dane Vane. The storm clawed at him, rain slashing his scared face, but he did not flinch. His dark hair was damp, clinging to his rugged jawline, and his long coat billowed as he fought against the wind. He had been a pirate for as long as the sea had known his name. He had seen death, cheated fate, and laughed in the face of curses. But this storm was different. Something called to him, not the winds, not the tide, but something deeper, something ancient. Then he saw her, a shake beneath the water, far below, where the sea churned violently. A woman. No, a mermaid. His sharp eyes locked onto the fading glow of her body. She wasn't moving. She wasn't swimming. "Damn it all," he growled under his breath. Without a moment's thought, Dane grabbed a rope, tying it around his waist. The crew shouted behind him, warning him not to go, but he ignored them. The sea had never been his master. Then he leaped. The water was ice against his skin, swallowing him whole. The world above became a distant dream, and all that remained was the deep. He kicked hard, slicing through the water, pushing against the weight of the storm trying to drag him back. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reached for the lifeless mermaid. Her hair floated like silver mist around her, and her lips, slightly parted, held no breath. He hesitated only for a second. Then he pulled her close. With one arm wrapped around her, the storm had passed, but the ship still swayed on restless waters. The Kraken's vow drifted beneath a sky of shattered clouds, the moonlight turning the sea to silver. The crew moved in hushed whispers, their boots clunking against the wet wood as they cast uneasy glances toward their captain. Dane Vane sat beside the unconscious mermaid, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. She lay wrapped in his coat, her silver hair spilling over the damp planks like strands of moonlight. Droplets of seawater still clung to her pearl-kissed skin, her body unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but just barely. The old deckhand, Rever, knelt nearby, his sea-worn face lined with deep frowns. "Captain," he muttered, his voice rough like the tide against jagged rocks. "You should have let her go." Dane didn't look at him. She would have died. She still might. Revar's weathered fingers tapped against the wooden deck. "A paralyzed mermaid. You know what they say, Vane. She's been forsaken. If the ocean no longer wants her, why should we?" Dane's jaw tightened. He knew the stories. Merfolk who lost their tails were said to be cursed, trapped between the world of men and the world of the sea, belonging to neither. Some said they brought misfortune. Some said they were already dead, only waiting for the tide to claim them. But Dane had never believed in fate. He dipped a cloth into a bucket of clean water, squeezing the excess from his fingers before gently pressing it to Naylora's cool forehead. The moment his skin touched hers, a faint glow pulsed beneath her pale skin, flickering like embers in the dark. Rever took a step back. Gods have mercy. Her magic still lingers. Dane's brows furrowed. Magic. That explained the storm. That explained the way the sea had fought him when he pulled her from the depths. Something about her had angered the waters, but he couldn't bring himself to care. She stirred. The glow faded as her lashes fluttered, dark against the ghostly pallor of her skin. Her breath came shallow at first, then deeper, until her fingers twitched. Then, with a sharp gasp, Naylora awoke. Her sapphire eyes darted around, wild and disoriented, her hands clenching against the fabric of Dane's coat. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, just the ghost of a breath, a silent plea. Dane leaned closer, his voice steady. "You're safe." She flinched. Her gaze flicked to the ropes, to the sails, to the vast horizon where the sea met the sky. But she did not find the home she had once known, only the endless stretch of open water. Her voice, when it finally came, was weak, like waves lapping against forgotten shores. "Where am I?" Dane exhaled. "Aboard my ship." Naylora tried to move, but the moment she shifted, pain shot through her spine. A broken cry escaped her lips as she collapsed against the deck, her arms trembling beneath her. Dane caught her before she could fall, steadying her gently. "Easy." She gasped for breath, her eyes wide with fear as realization struck. She couldn't move her tail. "No." The word was barely above a whisper. Desperate, she tried again, forcing her body to obey. But her once powerful tail remained still, useless, and lifeless beneath her. Panic flared in her eyes. "No, no, no." She gripped Dane's arm with surprising strength, her nails digging into his skin as she shook her head. "I can't swim. I can't." Dane didn't pull away. He let her hold on, let her shake, let her fight against the truth that had already settled in the silence of the night. "The ocean doesn't want me," she choked out, her voice breaking. "I am nothing without it." Dane studied her, his expression unreadable. He had seen men break before, had watched the strongest of warriors crumble when stripped of the only thing they knew. But this was different. She wasn't just grieving her body. She was grieving her very existence. A soft breeze passed between them, carrying the scent of salt and rain. Naylora's fingers loosened, but she didn't let go entirely. For the first time in his life, Dane wasn't sure what to say. He was a pirate, a man who had faced death 100 times over. He didn't deal in promises. But as he looked into her eyes, drowning in sorrow, he found himself breaking his own rules. "You are not nothing." His voice was quiet, but steady. "And you are not alone." Naylora's breath hitched. The sea had abandoned her. The world above did not welcome her. But this man, this pirate, had pulled her from the abyss, and now he refused to let her go. For the first time since the curse had stolen her strength, Naylora felt something stir within her chest. It was small, but it was hope. The Kraken's vow sailed through calm waters, its sails catching the gentle evening breeze. The storm had passed, but an unspoken tension lingered among the crew. They avoided looking too closely at the mermaid lying on the deck, wrapped in Dane's coat like a delicate treasure plucked from the sea. Naylora had not spoken much since that night, and the crew, though unsure of what to make of her, feared what her presence might bring. But not Dane. He stood at the bow, his silhouette a dark figure against the fading sun, the wind tugging at his coat and hair. His eyes, sharp as the edge of a cutlass, scanned the horizon, the steady rhythm of the ship beneath his feet offering little comfort. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, but he paid them no mind. Naylora had been silent for days, her body healing, but her spirit was fractured. She refused to leave the deck, and whenever Dane tried to speak with her, she would look away, as though not knowing where to begin. Then one evening, as dusk fell and the stars began to twinkle like pearls scattered across the sky, the cry went out. "Ship ahoy!" The lookout's voice rang sharp and urgent. Dane's heart clenched. He knew that cry. He had heard it 1,000 times, but this time it was different. This time it meant trouble. Within moments, the crew scrambled, the clang of metal and the rush of feet filling the air. Dane's sharp eyes focused on the horizon, where a ship appeared through the mist. A sleek, black vessel, its sails adorned with an ancient symbol of a serpent devouring its own tail. The Black Anchor. It was a name whispered in dread along the coasts. A cursed ship, led by Lord Kestar, a man who had once been a pirate like Dane, but who had betrayed his own soul for power. He was a hunter of the sea's most dangerous creatures, and he had heard the stories of the cursed mermaid. The wind howled as the Black Anchor drew closer, its massive, shadowed shape looming on the horizon. The crew of the Kraken's Vow tightened their grips on their weapons, fear in their eyes. But Dane's gaze was locked on the figure standing at the helm of the enemy ship. Kestar's dark silhouette stood like a king, his eyes glinting with greed. "Dane Vane," Kestar called, his voice carrying across the water, taunting and cold. "I've come for the treasure you've foolishly taken from the sea." Dane's grip tightened around the wheel of his ship. His heart thundered in his chest, but his voice was steady. "The sea will have no claim on her, Kestar. Not as long as I breathe." Nelora, who had been standing near the edge of the deck, turned slowly. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now held a flicker of something darker, fear and perhaps anger. She seemed to sense the danger before anyone else did, her gaze shifting between Dane and the approaching ship. "Why do they want me?" she whispered, her voice fragile, like a wave crashing against the rocks. Dane's eyes softened as he turned toward her. He could feel the weight of her question, the deep, unknowable sorrow behind it. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that they could sail away, out of reach of the Black Anchor's curse. But he knew that wasn't true. "Because you are not just a mermaid," he said quietly. "You are a prize, a weapon." Nelora's eyes flashed, and for a brief moment, she looked like a creature of the deep, her beauty and power untouchable. But it was quickly replaced by a shadow of fear. As Kestar's ship drew alongside the Kraken's Vow, the crew of both ships stared at each other across the water, the tension so thick it could be cut with a blade. The battle had already begun. "Dane," Nelora said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried all the weight of the sea in it. "I don't want to be their weapon." Dane stepped closer to her, his rough hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "You're not. You're mine to protect, and I'll die before I let them have you." The words were spoken with such certainty that Nelora's heart skipped a beat. For the first time since the curse had struck her, a flicker of warmth stirred in her chest. But they had no time to linger. The sound of the first arrow striking the side of the ship broke through their moment, and the battle began in earnest. The Black Anchor's men, ruthless and relentless, began to board the Kraken's Vow. Dane drew his cutlass with a sharp, practiced motion, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to fight. "Protect her," he shouted to his crew, his voice like a command from the depths. The battle raged on, the clash of steel ringing out in the night. But as Dane fought back the attackers, he kept his gaze on Nelora, who stood frozen, watching the chaos unfold around her. She was torn between the fear of the enemy and the growing trust in the man who had saved her. And deep down, Dane knew this was only the beginning. The moon hung high, casting its pale light over the battle-ravaged deck of the Kraken's Vow. Steel clashed against steel, and the cries of men echoed in the night. But through it all, Dane Vane fought like a force of nature. His cutlass moved with deadly precision, each strike carving through his enemies like the ocean carving through stone. His crew followed his lead, fierce and unyielding, but the enemy, Lord Kestar's ruthless men, showed no sign of slowing. Dane's eyes scanned the chaos around him, his pulse thundering in his ears, but his focus remained on one thing: one person. Naylora. The mermaid stood near the edge of the deck, her silver hair floating like a trail of moonlight behind her. She had not moved since the first arrow had struck the ship, her body tense, her eyes wide with terror. Dane could see the fear in her gaze, the fear of what she was becoming, and the fear of what the pirates might do to her. But she was not just a victim. In the deep recesses of the sea, she had been a queen, a creature of power. And now, trapped between two worlds, she was a prize hunted by those who knew nothing of her true strength. A cry broke through his thoughts. Dane turned just in time to see one of Kestor's men raise his sword toward Naylora. The mermaid's back was turned, and she didn't see the danger coming. Time seemed to slow. Without hesitation, Dan lunged. He was faster than any man alive, his feet sure on the slick deck. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, his cutlass slashing through the air to intercept the blow. The pirate's sword rang out with a shriek of metal as Dane parried it with a practiced movement, his strength enough to send the attacker stumbling back. "Stay close," Dane shouted, his voice rough as the wind. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the safety of the ship's quarters, away from the fighting. But Naylora resisted, her gaze flicking back to the chaos unfolding on the deck. "No," her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of the sea. "I can't hide. I can't run from them." Her eyes searched his face, desperate. "I am the storm, Dane. I am the curse that follows." Dane's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He had seen her fear, but this was something more. This was the acceptance of her fate. She thought she had no choice but to be the weapon they hunted, the creature the sea had cast aside. "You're not a curse," Dane said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise like the sharp edge of his blade. He stepped closer, his hands gentle as he cupped her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "And I won't let them take you." For a moment, everything around them faded, the sounds of battle, the cries of men, until there was only the two of them. Naylora's heart raced beneath his touch, and for a fleeting second, Dane saw the faintest shimmer of hope in her eyes, a spark that had been buried under sorrow and fear for so long. But their moment was broken when a shout rang out from the enemy ship. "Fire!" A barrage of arrows flew through the air, and Dane spun, pulling Naylora to the ground as the wooden deck splintered around them. He cursed under his breath, his instincts taking over as he shielded her with his body, the sharp sting of an arrow grazing his shoulder. "We can't keep this up," Dane muttered through gritted teeth, pain searing through his arm. "We need to fight back. Now." Naylora's eyes flicked to the enemy ship, her body trembling as the weight of her situation pressed down on her. But then, something stirred within her. The air around her seemed to shift, as if the sea itself was responding to her presence. Her hand, trembling at first, reached out toward the water below. And then, in an instant, the sea began to answer her call. A wave rose up, crashing against the side of the ship with the force of a storm. Dane's eyes widened as he watched the power of the ocean, the power Naylora had once commanded, flood the ship. Water swirled around them, dark and deep, as if the very heart of the sea had been unleashed. Naylora gasped, her voice trembling as she spoke the ancient words of the merfolk. "Return to the depths." The wave crashed again, knocking the men from Kestor's ship overboard, sending the attackers scrambling. But as Naylora's power surged, her body trembled, her strength draining with each call to the sea. Dane's hand shot out to steady her, his heart pounding. "Easy, Naylora," he said gently, his voice soft but firm. "You're not alone anymore." For the first time in days, Naylora's eyes softened, and the ocean seemed to calm. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "I don't know how long I can hold them back." "You don't have to," Dane said, his voice unwavering. "I won't let them take you. Not ever." But as the fight raged on, Dane knew deep in his soul that the battle was far from over. The storm was only just beginning. The Kraken's vow drifted slowly in the aftermath of the battle, the sails flapping softly against the still air. The storm that had raged within the ship's walls had finally calmed, but the damage was done. The crew moved like shadows across the deck, tending to the wounded, repairing the ship, and cleaning up the remnants of the fight. Dane stood at the bow, his figure outlined by the moonlight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His shoulder ached where an arrow had grazed him, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on his chest. They had won the battle, yes, but at what cost? Naylora. She stood near the edge of the ship, her silver hair flowing like the waves of the deep, her expression distant and haunted. Though the threat of Kestar's ship had been pushed back, the fear in her eyes had not fully faded. She was a mermaid, a being of the sea, but she was no longer sure what that meant for her. Without her tail, she had lost her place in the world, and without her connection to the ocean, she had lost herself. Dane's heart twisted as he watched her. He had promised to protect her, but each passing day he feared she was slipping further away, drowning in the same loneliness and fear that had haunted her since the curse had stolen her strength. Naylora. His voice was low, but it carried on the wind, reaching her where she stood. The mermaid turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment there was nothing but the silent space between them. She had become an enigma to him, a riddle he couldn't solve, and no matter how many battles they fought together, he felt as though he could not reach her. The question stung him more than he cared to admit. Why had he saved her? Was it because of the fierce connection he felt to her, the pull that seemed to draw him into her world? Or was it something deeper, something he couldn't name? "I couldn't let them take you," Dane answered, his voice quiet but certain. He stepped closer, the salt of the sea in the air mixing with the scent of the evening breeze. "I couldn't let them claim you as their weapon." Naylora's gaze faltered, and she looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "I am their weapon. The ocean itself abandoned me. Without my tail, I am nothing more than a ghost." Dane's heart clenched at her words. He reached out slowly, gently lifting her chin so their eyes met once more. "You're not a ghost, Naylora. You're more than that. I see it in you, this strength, this fire inside you. The ocean hasn't abandoned you, and neither have I." A flicker of something passed through her eyes, something soft and uncertain. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but the words caught in her throat. For a long moment she was silent, and the only sound was the creaking of the ship and the distant call of seagulls. "I don't know who I am without the sea," Naylora whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I feel lost. I can't remember what it's like to be free, to feel the pull of the ocean beneath me." Dane stepped closer, his voice softer, more vulnerable than it had been before. "Maybe you've forgotten what it's like to swim, but you haven't forgotten who you are. You're Naylora, the one who controls the tides, the one who can still feel the waves in her soul. You are not lost." Naylora's eyes shone with unshed tears, her face pale beneath the moonlight. The battle within her was plain to see. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to find that spark again, the spark of the powerful being she had once been. But doubt clouded her every thought, and the more she struggled, the further the ocean seemed to pull away. "I don't know if I can ever be what I was," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dane's heart ached at her words, but he didn't let the pain show. Instead, he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. It was warm, despite the coldness of the night. "You don't have to be what you were, Naylora. You can be what you are now." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something she couldn't name. And for a moment, the whole world seemed to pause. She wasn't alone anymore. Not while Dane was there, not while he held her hand, offering her more than just protection, offering her a chance to heal. Naylora took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around his, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir in her chest, a flicker of hope. She wasn't sure if it would last, but in this moment, it was enough. "I don't want to be alone," she whispered. Dane's grip on her hand tightened. "You're not alone. I won't let you be." The sea still roared in the distance, wild and untamable, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Naylora allowed herself to believe that she might have a place in this world after all. And as the moonlight bathed them both in its soft glow, the pirate and the mermaid stood together, ready to face whatever the tides of fate would bring next. The night was silent, but for the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The sky, a blanket of deep black, was lit by the pale light of the moon that bathed the Kraken's bow in an eerie glow. The ship rocked gently, as though the ocean itself was lulling the crew into a false sense of peace. But beneath the calm surface, danger still stirred. Dane Vane stood at the ship's helm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, eyes narrowed as though seeking something far beyond the sea. His heart was still heavy with the weight of their recent battle, but his thoughts now were consumed by something far more dangerous than Lord Kestar and his crew. It was the storm inside Naylora, the storm that he couldn't calm, no matter how hard he tried. Since that night when she had summoned the sea's power to protect them, she had been distant, retreating deeper into herself. Her beauty, her voice, even her presence felt far away now, like the sea she came from, vast and unreachable. Her silvery hair no longer shimmered like it had, and the light in her eyes had dimmed. She had come so close to losing herself in the fight. And now, every day that passed, it seemed as though she was slowly fading from him. Naylora had avoided the deck most of the day, staying hidden away in the ship's quarters. He had tried to reach her, tried to speak to her, but the distance between them felt like an ocean, too wide, too deep to cross. The thought of her withdrawing into that cold place inside herself made Dane's chest tighten. He couldn't lose her, not like this. He glanced over his shoulder, his gaze searching the deck. She was there, standing at the edge of the ship, her back to him. She was gazing out at the endless sea, her body rigid as the wind whipped through her hair. Her posture was one of someone lost, struggling to find their place in a world that no longer made sense. Dane's boots hit the wooden planks of the deck with a soft thud as he walked toward her, the sound drowned out by the roaring waves. He stopped behind her, not wanting to disturb the fragile moment between them. Naylora. His voice was low, quiet, but it was enough to make her stiffen, her shoulders tensing beneath his gaze. She didn't turn to him immediately. For a long moment, she simply stared out into the night, her features illuminated by the silvery glow of the moon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel the ocean inside me, Dane. But it's fading. The deeper I go, the more it slips away." Dane felt his heart skip. He had heard the sorrow in her voice, but now it was like a warning bell, tolling in his ears. She was lost, adrift in a sea of her own emotions, and he had no idea how to anchor her back to him. "You're not alone in this," he said, stepping closer, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. He could feel the tremble beneath her skin, the quiet storm she had been trying to keep inside. "I'm not going anywhere." Naylora turned slowly to face him, and for the first time in what felt like days, her eyes met his. But there was something in her gaze, something dark and unreadable, that made his chest tighten. She opened her mouth, as if to speak, but then paused, her lips trembling. "I don't want to pull you into this storm with me," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't want you to see what I'm becoming." Dane took a step closer, his hand reaching for hers. Her skin was cold, her fingers stiff with uncertainty. "Naylora, you're not becoming something terrible. You're just struggling. You've been through more than anyone should, but you're still you." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the truth in his words. "You can't fix this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't even fix this. I don't know what I am anymore." "You don't have to fix anything," he said softly, his voice steady as he took both of her hands in his. "Just let me be here. Let me help you carry this." For a long moment, Naylora didn't respond. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes focused on their intertwined hands. Then, slowly, she looked up at him again, her eyes searching his for something she hadn't found before. Dane's heart swelled as he looked into her eyes. "More than anything," he said, his voice filled with a certainty that surprised even him, "I won't leave you. Not ever." Naylora's breath caught in her throat as her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time in days, Dane saw the faintest glimmer of hope in her eyes. The tiniest spark of the woman she once was, the powerful mermaid who could command the tides. She didn't say anything more, but she didn't need to. Her grip on his hand spoke volumes. They stood there together, side by side, as the wind howled around them, and the waves crashed beneath their feet. The ocean was vast, and the storm still raged within her, but in that moment, Dane knew they would face it together. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. The wind howled through the sails of the Kraken's vow, tugging at the ship as though it were alive, fighting against the crew's efforts to guide it through the growing storm. The sky had darkened, and the sea churned violently beneath them, a foaming mass of fury and salt. It was as though the ocean itself was angry, a reflection of the turmoil that stirred within Naylora. Dane stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel with a force born of desperation. The waves crashed against the sides of the ship, sending a fine mist into the air. But it was nothing compared to the tempest inside the Mermaid. Since their quiet conversation on the deck, she had become more withdrawn, her thoughts sinking into the depths of the sea, and Dane could feel the distance growing between them. She had not spoken much since that night. Her silvery hair, once shining like moonlight on the water, now hung heavy and dull around her pale face. She had become like the ocean itself, beautiful but distant and full of sorrow. "Hold steady," Dane barked to the crew, his voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. The men scrambled to follow his orders, but even they could feel the tension in the air. This was no ordinary storm. It felt personal. It felt like the ocean was seeking something, and Dane feared it was calling to Naylora, the very thing she feared most. The mermaid had returned to the edge of the ship, her form almost lost in the shadow of the towering waves. She stood there as though she were one with the sea, her arms outstretched, as though beckoning something from the depths. Dane's heart clenched. He knew that look. It was the same one he had seen in her eyes when she had first spoken of losing her connection to the ocean. The same one that haunted her every night. Naylora's voice, when it came, was carried on the wind, a soft, almost mournful sound that reached Dane's ears like a whisper from the deep. "The ocean calls to me, Dane, but I don't know if I can answer." His gaze softened, his grip tightening on the wheel. She hadn't looked at him, but he could hear the pain in her voice, the same pain he had seen reflected in her eyes. The ocean was both her curse and her salvation, and now it was calling her back to a place she feared. Dane knew he couldn't force her to return to the sea, not if she didn't want to. But the ocean was her home, her essence. Without it, she was incomplete, lost between two worlds. He moved toward her, stepping carefully on the slippery deck, his boots creaking with each step. The wind howled louder, almost drowning out his words. When he reached her, he stood just behind her, watching her gaze stretch toward the horizon, her silhouette framed by the fury of the storm. "Naylora," he said, his voice low but firm, "you don't have to be afraid. You are not alone anymore." Her eyes flicked to him, her face a mask of sorrow. "I don't know how to be what I once was. The ocean, Dane, it's slipping away from me. It's like I'm drowning, but I can't breathe." Her voice trembled, and for the first time in days, Dane saw her vulnerability. The mermaid who had once commanded the sea was now a lost soul, adrift in a world she no longer recognized. She closed her eyes at his words, a tear slipping down her cheek. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, the wind stilling just enough for Dane to hear her quiet sobs. She had always been strong, always been the queen of the depths, but now she was just a woman, struggling to find her place in the world. "I'm scared, Dane," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what's left of me. I've already lost so much." Dane stepped closer, his heart aching for her, his grip tightening around her hand. "Then let me help you find it." I'll be with you, every step of the way. You don't have to face the ocean alone." For a moment, Naylora didn't respond. The storm raged around them, but inside the small bubble they shared, there was only silence. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something in her gaze, something hopeful, something that hadn't been there before. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, "but if you're with me, I'll always be with you," Dane said, his voice unwavering. And in that moment, the storm seemed to quiet, as though the sea itself had heard his promise. The wind calmed, and the waves, while still fierce, no longer felt quite so threatening. Naylora, for the first time in what felt like forever, allowed herself to believe. Together, they stood at the edge of the Kraken's Vow, facing the endless horizon. The ocean stretched before them, wild and untamed, but with each breath they took, Naylora felt herself finding a new strength. She wasn't the queen of the depths anymore, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be. And with Dane at her side, the storm no longer seemed so impossible to weather. The storm had passed, but the world still felt heavy, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The Kraken's Vow creaked and groaned with the lingering echo of the battle, but the sea had quieted beneath it, no longer raging but still restless, like a creature unsure whether it should return to the depths or remain in its turmoil. Naylora stood at the bow of the ship, her silvery hair whipping in the wind, her eyes gazing out over the endless horizon. The ocean, her ocean, stretched out before her, vast and unknowable. She had been born of its depths, raised by its currents, but now it felt like a stranger. The world she had once known felt distant, almost like a dream she couldn't reach. Dane stood beside her, silent but unwavering. His presence was a quiet anchor, steady and unyielding, as though he was holding her in place. Though they hadn't spoken much since the storm had passed, his mere closeness gave her a sense of calm she hadn't known in days. Her heart ached with the same question that had haunted her for so long. Who am I without the sea? The answer still eluded her, but now, with Dane beside her, the weight of that question didn't feel quite so heavy. He didn't ask her to be anything. He didn't expect her to return to who she once was. He accepted her, lost and uncertain, but still herself, still Naylora. "I never thought I'd see the ocean again," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft lapping of the waves against the ship's hull. "It feels like it's slipping through my fingers, Dane." He glanced at her, his eyes soft with understanding. "The ocean's never gone, Naylora. It's a part of you, always has been, and it will always call to you." She shook her head, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "But it's different now. I don't have my tail. I don't have the strength I once did. I don't know if I'll ever be the same again." Dane took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "You don't have to be the same, Naylora. The sea is a part of you, but it doesn't define you. You're more than that." Naylora looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something, an answer, perhaps, or a sign that she wasn't as lost as she felt. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a vulnerability that had been buried beneath layers of strength. But there was also something else, something she hadn't realized until now. There was love in her heart, not just for the ocean, but for the man who had stood by her side through everything. Dane had never once asked her to be something she wasn't. He had only asked her to be herself. And that, more than anything, gave her hope. "I don't know if I can find my way back to the sea," Naylora whispered, "but I know I don't want to do it alone." "You don't have to," Dane said, his voice steady and unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere, Naylora. Whatever happens, I'll be right here." Her heart fluttered at his words. She had feared for so long that her curse, her loss, would drive him away, that the distance between her and the ocean would create an unbridgeable gap between them. But Dane had never wavered, never faltered. His love had been a steady force, one that had pulled her from the darkness time and time again. As the Kraken's vow sailed on through the calm waters, Naylora turned to face him, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. His rugged face was soft in the moonlight, and she saw not just a pirate captain, but a man who had become her anchor, her refuge from the storm. "I don't know what's next for me," Naylora said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I know that I want to try. I want to find a way to live, to be, without the ocean pulling me under." Dane smiled softly, his eyes filled with a tenderness she hadn't seen before. "Then we'll find it together, you and me." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Naylora allowed herself to truly believe it. She wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She was more than her curse, more than her power over the sea. She was Naylora, the mermaid who had once ruled the tides, and now, the woman who had learned that love and belonging weren't confined to the depths of the ocean. And as the ship cut through the quiet waters, Naylora felt something stir within her, a spark of hope, a promise of something more. The sea was still a part of her, still calling to her, but now there was no fear in the pull. She wasn't alone. She had Dane by her side, and that was enough. Together, they faced the future, knowing that whatever the ocean had in store for her, she was no longer adrift. She had found her anchor.